Hello everyone, my name is Victoria. Today, me and my friend Audrey and Ivana will tell you about new historical and cultural criticism. And what are we going to talk about? The first one is new historicism, then new historicism and literature, cultural criticism and literature, questions new historical and cultural critics ask, and a new historical reading of The Great Gatsby. The first one is new historicism. The questions asked by traditional historicism and by new histories are quite different, and that's because those two approaches to history are based on very different views of what history is and how we can know it. Traditional historians ask, what happened and what does the events tell us about history? While in contrast, new historians ask, how has the event been interpreted and what do the interpretations tell us about the interpreters? For more traditional historians, history is a series of events that have a linear causal relationship, like event A caused event B caused event C, and so on. Furthermore, they believe we are perfectly capable through objective analysis of uncovering the facts about historical events, and those facts can sometimes reveal the spirit of the age, that is, the worldview held by the culture to which those facts refer. Traditional historians generally believe that history is progressive, that the human species is improving over the course of time, advancing in its moral, culture, and technological accomplishment. New historians, in contrast, don't believe we have clear access to any but the most basic facts of history. For new history is strictly a matter of interpretation, not fact, even when traditional historians believe they are sticking to the facts. The way they contextualize those facts determines what story those facts will tell, including which facts are deemed important enough to report and which are left out. From this perspective, there is no such thing as representation of facts, there's only interpretation. Furthermore, new historians argue that reliable interpretations are, for a number of reasons, difficult to produce. The first and most important reason for this difficulty, new historians believe, is the impossibility of objective analysis. Like all human beings, historians live in a particular time and place, and their views of both current and past events are influenced in innumerable, concise, and unconscious ways by their own experience within their own culture. Historians may believe they're being objective, but their own views of what is right and wrong, what is civilized and uncivilized, what is important and unimportant, will strongly influence the ways in which they interpret events. Another reason for the difficulty in producing reliable interpretations of history is its complexity. For new histories, history cannot be understood simply as a linear progression of events. At any given point in history, any given culture may be progressing in some areas and regressing in others, and any two historians may disagree about what constitutes progress and what doesn't, for these terms are matters of definition. History isn't an orderly parade into a continually improving future, as many traditional historians may believe. It's more like an improvised dance consisting of an infinite variety of steps, following any new route at any given moment, and having no particular goal or destination. Individuals and groups of people may have goals, but human history doesn't. Similarly, while events certainly have causes, new historians argue that those causes are usually multiple, complex, and difficult to analyze. One cannot make simple causal elements simple causal statements with any certainty. In addition, causality is not a one-way street from cause to effect. Any given event is a product of its culture, but it also affects that culture in return. In other words, all events are shaped by and shape the culture in which they emerge. According to new histories, power does not emanate only from the top of the political and socio-economic structure. And according to French philosopher Michel Foucault, I'm sorry if I misspelled the name, whose ideas have strongly influenced the development of new historicism, power circulates in all directions, to and from all social levels, at all times. A discourse is a social language created by a particular cultural condition at a particular time and place, and it expresses a particular way of understanding human experience. Although the word discourse has roughly the same meaning as the word ideology, and the two terms are often used interchangeably. The word discourse draws attention to the role of language as the vehicle of ideology. A plurality of voices, including an equal representation of historical narrative from all groups, helps ensure that a master narrative will no longer control our historical understanding. A plurality of historical voices also tends to raise issues that new historicism considers important, such as how ideology operates in the formation of personal and group identity, how a culture's perception of itself influences its political, legal, and social policies and customs, and how power circulates in a given culture. History is a text that is interpreted by different cultures to the ideological needs of their own power structures, which is a new historical concern. In this context, new historicism might be denied as the history of stories cultures tell themselves about themselves, or as a corrective to some traditional historical accounts. New historicism might be denied as the history of lies cultures tell themselves. There's no history in the traditional sense of the term. There are only representations of history. In addition to its focus on marginalized historical narratives, new historical analysis involves what is called thick description, a term borrowed from anthropology. Thick description attempts through close, detailed examination of a given cultural production, such as birthing practices, ritual ceremonies, games, penal codes, sports art, corporate laws, to discover the meaning that particular cultural production had for the people in whose community it occurred and to reveal the social convention, cultural codes, and ways of seeing the world that gave the production those meanings. The thick description is not a search for facts, but a search for meaning. And as the example of culture production illustrate, the description focuses on the personal side of history, as much as more than on such traditional historical topics as military campaigns and the passage of laws. Indeed, because traditional historicism tended to ignore or marginalize private life as subjective and irrelevant, new historicism tries to compensate for this omission by bringing issues concerned with private life into the foreground of historical inquiry. And finally, new historicism claimed that historical analysis is unavoidably subjective, is not an attempt to legitimize of self-indulgence. Anything goes attitude toward the writing of history. Next is about new historicism and literature. Although new historical literary criticism embeds our study of literary text in a study of history isn't what it used to be. Therefore, new historical criticism has little in common with traditional historical criticism. The latter, which dominated literary studies in the 19th century and the early decades of the 20s, confined himself largely to study of the author's century and author's life, in order to discover his or her intentions in writing the work, or to studies of the historical period in which the work was written, in order to reveal the spirit of the age, the century, which the text was then shown to embody. For traditional literary historicism, literature existed in a purely subjective realm, unlike history, which consisted of objectively discernible facts. Therefore, literature could never be interpreted to mean anything that history didn't authorize it to mean. New criticism, which dethroned traditional historical criticism and controlled literary studies from the 1940s to the 1960s, rejected traditional historicism's approaches to literature. For the new critics, the only thing literary historians could offer was interesting background material about literary works. The understanding of a text's meaning, however, has nothing whatsoever to do with history. The new critics argued because great literary works are timeless, autonomous art objects that exist in a realm beyond history. As a result of new critical dominance, the historical study of literature faded into the background and tried to content itself with the task new criticism deemed its proper work. New historicism, which emerged in the late 1970s, rejects both traditional historicism's marginalization of literature and new criticism and enshrinement of the literary text in a timeless dimension beyond history. Literary texts are cultural artifacts that can tell us something about the interplay of discourse, the web of social meanings operating in the time and place in which the text was written. Traditional historical criticism, history is an objective reality that can be known and against which the subjective literary work is interpreted or measured. In contrast, in the new historical examples, the focus is on how the literary text itself functions as a historical discourse interacting with other historical discourses. Those circulating at the time and place in which the text is set, at the time the text was published, or at later points in history of the text's receptions. For new historicism is concerned not with historical events as events, but with the ways in which events are interpreted, the historical discourses with ways of seeing the world and modes of meaning. Indeed, as we saw earlier, historical events are viewed by new historicists not as facts to be documented, but as texts to be read. In order to help us speculate about how human cultures at various historical moments have made sense of themselves and their world. We can't really know exactly what happened at any given point in history, but we can know what the people involved believed happened, and we can interpret those interpretations. For new historical literary critics, then the literary text, through its representation of humans' experience at a given time and place, is an interpretation of history. As such, the literary text maps the discourses circulating at the time it was written and is itself one of those discourses that is the literary text shaped and was shaped by the discourses circulating in the culture in which it was produced. Likewise, our interpretation of literature shape and are shaped by the culture in which we live. The next will be Audrey.
Okay, so the next one is I'm going to be talking about the cultural criticism. So, cultural criticism shares with the new historicism the view that human history and culture constitute a complex arena of dynamic forces of which we can construct only a partial and subjective picture. Both fields share the belief that individual human subjectively develops in a give and take relationship with its cultural, while we are constrained within the limits with its cultural that sets by our culture. We may struggle against those limits or when we want to transform them. And both fields are interdisciplinary, or perhaps more accurately, anti-disciplinary. For both argue that human experience, which is the stuff of human history and culture, cannot be adequately understood by means of academic disciplines as sociology, psychology, literature, and so forth. Indeed, both cultural criticism and new historicism draw heavily on the same philosophical sources, in particular the work of French philosopher Michel Foucault, and in practice, cultural criticism is not always readily distinguishable from the new historicism. During the mid-1960s, cultural criticism, in the narrower definition of the term, argues that working-class culture has been misunderstood and undervalued. The dominant class dictates what forms of art to be considered high, superior culture, such as the ballet, the opera, and the other fine arts. Forms of popular culture, on the other hand, such as television situation comedies, popular music, and pulp fiction, have been relegated to the status of low, inferior culture. For cultural critics, however, there is no meaningful distinction between high and low forms of culture. For all cultural productions can be analyzed to reveal the cultural work they perform, that is, the ways in which they shape our experience by transmitting or transforming our ideologies, which means, of course, the role of cultural productions in the circulation of power. For cultural critics, culture is a process, not a product. It is a lived experience and not a fixed definition. More precisely, a culture is a collection of interactive cultures, each of which is growing and changing, each of which is constituted at any given moment in time by the intersection of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, occupation, and similar factors that contribute the experience of its members. To sum up, cultural criticism shares the new historicism's theoretical premises except in the following three instances. The first one is cultural criticism tends to be more overtly political in its support of oppressed groups. The second one is because of its political orientation, cultural criticism often draws on Marxist, feminist, and other political theories in performing its analysis. And the last one is cultural criticism in a narrower sense of the term is especially interested in popular culture. And the next one is going to be explained by Ivana.
So next I will explain about cultural criticism and literature. So for cultural critics, literary text or other type of cultural production present cultural works based on the cultural experiences of the people who experience them. According to Stephen Greenblatt, we can examine the types of cultural works presented by literary texts with several questions that has been written in the book. So actually there are 6 questions. The first one is what kind of behavior what models of practice and does this work seems to enforce. And the second one is, why might readers at a particular time and place find this work compelling? And the third, are these differences between my values and the values implicit in the work am I reading? And the fourth is, upon what social understandings does the work depend? And the fifth is, whose freedom of thought or movement might be concentrated implicitly or explicitly by this work. And the last is, what are the larger social structure with which this particular act of praise or blame, that is, the text's apparent ethical orientation, might be connected. And Greenblatt also said that perhaps in cultural analysis is a servant of literary study, but in liberal education, literary study is a servant of cultural understanding. So all of the above questions ask us to make connections between a literary text, the cultural in which appears, and also the culture in which is interpreted. So, in examining popular culture, high culture, or both, cultural critics try to map the changing ideological functions that a given cultural production perform at the hands of those who respond to it.
So next is some question new historical and cultural critics ask about literary texts. So the following question that has been written in the book are intended to summarize approaches to literary analysis employed by new historic and cultural critics. And in the terminology of cultural criticism, this question offers us ways to examine the cultural work performed by literary texts. These questions are the way in which a new historical or cultural critic might address them. For such critics, there's no historical event, artifact, or ideology can be completely understood in isolation from the innumerable historic events, artifact, and ideology among which it circulates, and our own cultural experience invincibly and influences our perception, making true objectivity impossible.
Actually, there are 5 questions that represent it. The first one is, how does the literary text function as part of continuum with other historical and cultural texts from the same period? So that is the first question. And the second is, how can we use a literary work to map the interplay of both traditional and subversive discourses circulating in the culture in which that work emerged, and or the cultures in which the work has been interpreted? And the third it is using rhetorical analysis. So what does the literary text add to our understanding, have influenced, overlapped with, and combated with one another at specific historical moments? And the fourth is, what does the literary work suggest about the experience of groups of people who have been ignored, underrepresented, or misrepresented by traditional history? So, and the last is, how has the work's reception by literary critics and the reading public, including the reception at its point of origin, changing responses to work over time and its possible future relationship with its audience, being shaped by and shape the culture in which that reception occurred? So, depending on the literary text in question, we might ask one or any combination of these questions, or we might come up with a useful question not listed here. And there are just some starting point to get us thinking about literary texts as new historical and cultural critics do.
Okay, so last I'm going to be talking about a new historical reading of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. As a great literary work, The Great Gatsby's meaning needs to be interpreted in context of the history and culture in which it was written and the culture in which we live today, because our interpretation is biased and subjective as part of our cultural conditioning and ideologies. This story reflects the discourse of the self-made man circulating in so many texts that both shaped and were shaped by American culture during the final decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th. Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby at a time when people really believed a person could raise their born station in life and achieving limitless success. It was an era full of men achieving the rags to riches lifestyle. The idea of the self-made man itself was proven possible by millionaires like John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, Jim Fisk, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Philip Ermore, and James G. Hill. Circulating throughout society were numerous works that described how, with determination, hard work, and perseverance, anybody could become rich and successful because character, rather than education or business acumen, was considered the foundation of the self-made man. The ascendance of Jay Gatsby from the story and his poor childhood as James gets to the rich and powerful protagonist of the novel mirrored to the contemporary discourses of the era. But despite his accomplishments, Gatsby tries to deny his past. He tried to abolish his true identity and in the wake of his new persona as Jay Gatsby. And in this way, this novel strives to escape history and transcend the historical realities of time, place, and human limitation. This novel also shows us how the circulation of the discourses has very personal implications for all of us. For it illustrates the way in which cultural discourses are the raw materials from which we fashion our individual identities. That's why understanding the complex meaning within The Great Gatsby requires a broad understanding of its historical and cultural context, which is the aim of these critical literary theories. Okay, so that's all from our group. Thank you.